Welcome, my lovelies, to another fascinating look at context, our favorite word this year. So before we begin our look at industrialization in Europe, essentially during the 19th century, we need to start looking at the context. So once again, for those of you who do remember, context is looking at what is going on around at the time that is going to influence the events in question. And we move on. Which brings us to our learning outcomes. So here, out of watching this video about the context of the Industrial Revolution, I'm hoping that you understand the context of the Industrial Revolution. And then also to make connections between the industrialization that we're seeing in the 19th century, that is the 1800s, with previous things that we've discussed in the Renaissance and the Reformation. I know you thought you were done with it, but it is time to dust off some of those Renaissance and Reformation notes because you will be using it. And then finally, explain the circumstances that allowed the Industrial Revolution to begin in England. So we're going to pull all of this together to try to understand what's really going on in the Industrial Revolution. And we need to have this information before we start looking at the revolution itself. And here we go, looking at the European Renaissance and essentially those ideas of individualism. Again, remember that the Renaissance was a few hundred years just by itself. And so what we're really talking about here is the culture that it created. Essentially, we're saying that the Renaissance created a culture that allowed, that provided for elements important to industrialization centuries later. And let's review a little bit. We talked about this when we were talking about the Renaissance, Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. And I'd like to give a shout out to Sukaina for incorporating Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs into her analysis during her presentation. Awesome. Anywho, so one of the things that we said about the Renaissance was that this was a time when people were moving up Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. And one of the reasons why we're reviewing this is because I want you to keep it in mind as we talk about the Industrial Revolution and some of the changes that it causes in society. And just a quick review. As you well know, the first step in Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs is meeting those basic needs that keep you alive. Food, water, shelter, rest, the basic things that you need. And as things change, you start looking, once the physical things are taken care of, then you start thinking about other aspects. You move up the hierarchy. It's the safety needs. These are still our basic needs, but a little bit beyond just food and survival. So taking care of security, having like safety of self. And then we start moving to things that are beyond just keeping us alive. And we're talking about the psychological things like belongingness and having relationships with your family, with your friends. And once you are well fed, you are safe, and you have good intimate relations, like with your family, you have a good sort of community, then you can move up the hierarchy more into esteem needs, so prestige and feeling of accomplishment. I hope this is jogging your memory about the Renaissance. Yeah. And then once you've met those, that's when you have the opportunity to achieve your full potential, which sounds like what magic word? Yeah, you should have gotten that. This is the self-fulfillment needs. Now, keep this hierarchy in mind again as we talk about these massive changes that industrialization is going to bring to European society and American. Right! One of the biggies that we talked about a lot was individualism. And so during the Renaissance, we have this idea of the individual being capable of rational thought, the individual being capable of own decision making. the individual having the right to put his or her ideas out there, and there's validity in those ideas, and that everything doesn't have to be so much about the community anymore. The idea of competition between individuals for influence. So all of this stuff is happening, and changing the way people view themselves, the role that they play in society, the way that they interact with each other. And I like this image on the right here because in some ways you have what individualism leads to, right? This imaginative thinking, the craftsman, the engineer, the scientist who observes and has scientific thinking, and the philosopher that just reasons and comes up with different ways of thinking about the world. What I would like you to do now is for like a few seconds, just pause for a little bit. When we talked about the Renaissance, were there any philosophers? Any imaginative thinkers? Any engineers, craftsmen, or scientists that we talked about that kind of fit into this role and exhibit the individualism? Really, you should pause this. But another biggie of our discussion during the Renaissance was secularism, the idea of the separation of church and state, the idea that one's entire life does not need to revolve around religion, and once an individual's life doesn't need to revolve only about religion, it is now there's separation between how I live my life, how I interact with everybody, and the religion, right? And so one of the things that we saw in terms of secularism is now people are trying to focus, are starting to focus on the way that they live and the world that they live in, not spending all of their time focusing on what they need to do for the next life. The idea that this life is as important as the next life. And when secularism and individualism are building together, we also have this move towards humanism. And you guys know I love this painting. And one of the reasons why I chose this image is, if you don't remember, this is Raphael's The School of Athens. And here we have all of these great thinkers, because again, the focus of humanism is this idea of individual potential. The idea that the individual should be working to better him or herself, to learn. And not only is the individual developing and learning, but the individual can push that learning to create awesomeness. So we're talking about human potential, not just as an individual, but the human potential to explain how the world works, to learn and create like blocks of knowledge that people can then use. I'm telling you guys, next year in TOK, this is so gonna be important. And if you remember from the School of Athens, we have like Pythagoras, we have Raphael in there, and Michelangelo, and all of these, and like Plato and Aristotle. So all of these people who furthered human knowledge, who explained all of this awesome stuff about the world, and that are then therefore allowed people to create things like using the math of people like Pythagoras, then we can engineer domes and buildings and all of this cool stuff. It's amazing. And so one of the biggest things to come out of this Renaissance is this scientific revolution, this new way of looking at the world and the development of the sciences. And there's an explosion in scientific thinking, in exploring how the world works, and the development of new technologies like the telescope, like Isaac Newton developing these maths like calculus. That's right, as you're suffering through calculus, you can thank Isaac Newton. Developing calculus that then can be used for greater feats of engineering. You have people looking at the human body and understanding, figuring out how the circulatory system works. And there is this massive explosion of information in chemistry, in physics, in biology. And all of this is going to help set the stage for what we're going to see happening in the Industrial Revolution. So one of the things that's happening at the same time is this age of exploration in Europe. And looking at our handy dandy map here, you can see all the various journeys that were happening in Western Europe. And this feeds to kind of this sort of explosion in the time. It adds to the secularism because people are moving to different parts of the world and coming back with plants and animals and meeting people that they had never seen before. And these are not explanations that they can find answers to through religion. So they start looking in other places, looking to themselves, looking through their ability to reason, to come up with answers, observing the world and answering the questions that have arisen. This age of exploration also feeds into the scientific revolution. People are coming across new technologies, new plant species that they have to scientifically explore. So, and it feeds into this age of exploration is going to feed into nationalism that we're going to talk about later. And this is all part and parcel of what is happening. And looking at this handy dandy map, we can see some of the various things that people are bringing back to Europe. And this is going to help feed into the wealth that develops in Europe, but it's also going to feed into that spark of curiosity and humanism and thinking that is going on at this time. And last but not least is protonationalism. And you're like, but Ms. Michelle, what is protonationalism? Well, here comes some word learning. Proto is a prefix that comes from ancient Greek, and it means the beginnings of something, the first or the beginning. It's not fully there yet, but it's starting. Like the word prototype. Ah, goosh, mind blown. Okay, not really. But so the Renaissance is this time of proto-nationalism. This is when we start having the seeds of nationalism forming as monarchs are wanting to be more individualistic. What they start doing is identifying themselves with that of their state. And so we have more competition between states. And the other thing that is also happening is as more people are using the vernacular and like the official language becomes the vernacular, language starts becoming a tie that for people. So people are becoming more aware of the ways that they are similar to each other, but different from those people over there. And they're identifying with each other and with a state. And that state is also connected with a monarch. And one of the ways this is happening is because of this massive increase in wealth. And so monarchs are spending money on themselves, of course, but also on that state, on monuments that represent them and the state, in spending money on wars and competition to gain influence in Europe and internationally for the glory of the state. And so what we can see happening here is as nationalism is beginning during the Renaissance, and it starts to gather more and more flesh, so to speak. No, more and more sort of momentum over the course of centuries. And we're going to see it really come to head and kind of explode and become something big during the 19th century, during this time of industrialization. And at the beginning of the video, we talked about industrialization from 1750 to 1914. And in essence, in a very real way, nationalism sort of explodes with World War I. And we end in 1914 because when we look at World War I, it is sort of like a culmination of all of these various ideas. That's all, folks. I lied. This is only for now. So that's the first half. The second half is going to look at the Reformation and other things that help bring this industrialization about, and of course leads to 1914 and World War I.